Great. I don't even know how to start this, but this is Lynch. I'm Ozzie. We're going to chat about forecasting, going to experiment with this method to see if other people like it and if it's something that we should continue going with.
Yeah, this arose out of us having a chat about AI time, like different forecasting thoughts and AI timelines and stuff. And then Ozzy was like, maybe this would be good to have like a lot of people conversing or something. And I was like, why don't we record this? And maybe a few people might look at it or something. And then we'll see if that actually happens.
Man, I feel like I have this like third party watching me that I'm trying to, which is changes things, but we could definitely just see how it goes.
Yeah. I'm gonna pretend nobody's watching, except like if there's anything offensive on my side, I won't.
Yeah, no, we have to not say, there's some topics that are confidential.
Yeah. Nothing confidential or like, yeah, stuff like that.
So the broad thing we wanted to go over for this was basically the question of how do we do forecasting for long-termist stuff. Specifically, the question is like, who do we trust to do the forecasting? So
Yeah.
a bit of context. Sorry, I'm trying to figure. Yeah. Sorry, this was put on the fly. But my impression is that the different candidates, we have super forecasters who we really know that they work on like a 1 to 3 year time scale. Like they haven't tried that much of like questions on a 50-year time scale, especially ones that are like very intense for EAs. We also know that that's one thing that we know. We also know that like in general, experts do poorly in the area of expertise in terms of forecasting questions. Like there's quite a bit of evidence for them. There's quite a bit of reasons to think that there'd be bias for different reasons. The motivations aren't that good. There's selection pressure, etc. Yeah, so those are kind of some different options. At the same time, we know that like the people that EAs look up to for some of the key things are going to always be like the top respected people, right?
Yeah, so like EAs often look up to like super forecasters and experts, for example, in this
Yeah,
case.
but within EA, I'm just saying that like we typically look up to other EAs. So it would be saying like, what does Holden think? What does Will think? I think it'd be quite strange for us to say, oh, stop listening to those people, start listening to super forecasters, listen to those people. Right?
Yeah, we're like, some other group of people we identified.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's this big question of like, are we going to trust super forecasters? Like, what should we set up to predict big things like when is Earth going to, like, when is the next risk going to happen? What type is it, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out how to lead this, but yeah. Do you have any high-level thoughts to begin with?
Yeah, I think one thing that people don't understand is like how, I think I mentioned this before, but like, forecasting is a super nascent and, pre-paradigm field as like we've discussed before. So yeah, it's just, a lot of this is we just don't know, and we're just trying to, figure this out throughout this conversation and stuff. So we'll see how it goes. And, I'm sure I'll say some dumb things. Ozzy might say some dumb things, but it's fine. We'll try our best.
I feel like with the setting, like I'm a news anchor or something. It is. It's quite hard to
Oh,
like get back into the like, oh, just having a conversation frame.
yeah. So one thing I was interested in is like
Yeah.
diving into like what I think are like potential like biases that like super forecasters might have, that are like that could get you like fairly accurate like results under like some definitions of accuracy, but might, you know, it is in theory and both in theory and practice possible to do better
Yeah.
for like these long-term questions. Um, One thing that I think is like noticeable for like the hmm, one thing that I think is like somewhat noticeable is that like, or at least intuitive to me, is that if you use a Brier score based scoring system, the difference between like 1%, giving 1% probability and 0% is like very minimal in terms of how uh, like how bad it is for your score. I mean, in technical terms, these are like Brier score is a proper scoring rule. So you do slightly do better if it's actually 1%. You actually give 1%. But like yeah, if you do the math, like if the true probability is like 5%, and if you give 1%, then you do just as badly as if you give 9%, for example, which seems like pretty bad from like a different perspective where this is 5x the difference improbability versus 1.8x, for example. I suspect that like this means that like if you're a super forecaster or somebody else who's like trained really well on a Briar score, you're like probably pretty damn well calibrated at like in the median. So like it's very like you're probably pretty good at knowing the difference between 40% and 60%. But there's like no meaningful incentive to like know the difference between like 0.3% and 0.6%, even though like this is like a huge difference, right? Or like for Lavier questions, maybe it's not as decision relevant, but even greater differences like 0.1% versus 0.5%, for example, there just isn't like enough feedback for you to know, and there isn't like enough feedback for anything even close to that for you to really care about the difference in some sense. That's like one reason I think that super forecasters may not be good. Of course, of course, like this might just be true for all other groups where they don't do any forecasting at those domains. So yeah, it's hard to know.
Yeah. I guess I'm taking notes, and I can imagine some structure to the conversation being useful. At the same time, it's obviously kind of difficult. Like I'd be interested in ways to convert, to merge that with a conversation like that. I'm not super sure. So you presented. So there's one point which is about low probabilities.
Yeah.
My guess is that that's like one of a few different subtopics of like, should we trust the super forecasters versus other people? Because a lot of the things 50 years from now are going to have high probabilities. So some of the could be like, what's the GDP of the US? Is the US still around? Right. Hopefully there's a high probability.
Sure. I mean, it's like it's symmetrically true for very high probabilities.
But yeah, I mean, like the whole space in between. I imagine a lot of the questions that we could ask that could be interesting could still be kind of mixed.
Sure. I think the real thing that we're getting at isn't quite like low probabilities, in my opinion, but something like out of distribution problems. Is roughly how I would classify a lot of these things.
So yeah, I think a really key question is like, what exactly are these super forecasters good at? Like they've been tested in a few very specific experimental settings that were kind of optimized to be experimental settings, from what I gather.
Yeah.
But from what I understand, super forecasters aren't correct all of a sudden. It's not like they are suddenly unbiased about religion and now all of them are like non-religious and like have the correct, moral views and the correct political views and are like, totally like humble. I think that a lot of them are still quite overconfident in the ways that a lot of people are overconfident. Just in the sense that like if there are three people who have 99.9% confidence in a religion, but they're different religions, then the average Briar score is going to be very bad, right? So you know that on average they're very overconfident. You don't know which one.
Yeah, you don't know which one.
Yeah. So I think that like, the super forecasters that we have aren't like universally calibrated. They're just like kind of calibrating this. I don't even know what universal calibration would look like. It'd probably look insane. Like you're like this enlightened individual who has like recognized all these faults that we have in society. Like if you take someone, a super forecaster,
really just really confuse a lot of things. If that makes sense.
So I guess if you take a super forecasting team and put them back 200 years, they probably would have been very like religious, assuming they were in Western culture, right? So they would probably assume that like religion was correct, and that like like maybe they were kind of racist. Maybe like they would have followed a whole bunch of other positions that we now very much don't agree with, right?
Yeah. I mean, I have like some tweets where I think like facts value distinction isn't perfect for humans, but I do think there's something to it or something like
what distinction? Sorry.
Like the distinction between facts and values. Like there's a sense in which racism is like a moral choice, right? And like it's very hard to like I don't know. It's not usually grounded in like specific factual claims and stuff like that.
Historically, there's been a lot, at least, right? Like if you wouldn't have
sure. You mean like the craniology or whatever. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think and that's also true for like animal rights or like women's rights and like a whole bunch of those rights. I think a lot of that was grounded in some beliefs that like either religion or other things.
Yeah. I mean, as a side, I find myself pretty confused by a lot of those things. Like Descartes, like didn't think animals had any experiences, so he like tortured cats and whatever. But I feel like this is just like really exception or something. I feel like this is just not I don't know, just not like an actual opinion lots of people had. Or like, I mean, these days, like 99% of Americans in polls say, they think animals suffer and stuff. And, they just don't value it that much. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
I mean,
confused.
he definitely had a pretty extreme view, but I'd be very curious. Like, I could totally imagine that people may not value it, but they don't quite grok or intuit or recognize the fact that they do suffer. But if they were able to understand that they suffer quite as much as they do, then they'd be much less likely.
Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, it's one of those things where like
Yeah,
maybe at the boundaries, like facts and values, like kind of this in like a clean separation or something.
it's tricky.
But yeah,
It's also
um,
very advantageous to have the wrong beliefs in a lot of these settings, right? Like, it's just
true.
like a lot easier if you believe that animals are fine, like don't suffer at all,
Yeah,
right? Um,
totally. Yeah,
so yeah, I mean, like the super forecasters, it is kind of interesting that like if they are kind of so accurate, they didn't like accidentally discover any huge new insights about the world, right?
yeah,
It's not like they were put on questions about the politics of, say, Russia, and meanwhile they realized that the whole way that we were doing something was just like incredibly wrong, right? I imagine
yeah,
society is just like incredibly wrong in a whole bunch of ways that we can't yet recognize. So it's
yeah.
quite obvious that
Just
we're
as
probably overconfident. Yeah.
Yeah, just as a side note, we have worked with super forecasters before, and we do know them in like various EA community settings. So at some point, if we keep doing this chats, we should like ask like somebody who is like a super forecaster and stuff like that to like give their hot takes on how wrong we are about these things. That'd be fun.
Yeah, I definitely
Yeah,
agree. It'd be great to bring some of them in and maybe we just like have chats with them.
yeah.
Yeah, we've worked with a few. We know a few, like there are a few in the EA community. Um, yeah, I mean, I have nothing against them. I think that like that stuff is great. It's just that hypothetically, what we're hoping to have are these like totally epistemically valid methodologies, and I think that's not totally what they are right now. Right, we have a ways to go.
Yeah. I mean, valid would not be the word I would use, but extremely high predictive accuracy, up to 50 years for like as high as humanly realistically possible or something. I'm sure like our epistemic settings right
Yeah.
now are like pretty far from that, but yeah, we might converge to a better one if you try
Even
really
like day
hard.
to day, I'm just really curious. Like my impression is that people are generally overconfident about a lot of things. Like I think there's
Yeah,
quite a bit of evidence about that. Like most people think that they're overconfident about how good they are. Like everyone thinks that they're a better driver generally. No one wants to believe that they're a bad parent, even if they were a terrible parent. They don't want to be like, oh yeah, I was like a D minus parent, but that's the best I could have done.
yeah. I don't
Um,
know how well that generalizes to like near the top of the distribution, if that makes sense. Like I feel
no,
like
yeah,
quite,
like the
for
best
example,
people.
quite a,
Yeah,
well, not even the best, like top 5% or whatever.
yeah.
Yeah. Like I don't know, like a lot of my friends think they're bad driving. I know I'm bad at driving, but I mean it's easy for me to know because yeah.
A lot of the very smart people I know personally, I feel like are pretty overconfident. Just even if it's not true that any one of them is overconfident, it's the same thing as like religion. Like if you just put their beliefs, they just are overconfident about different things. So that
Yeah.
means that on average they're overconfident.
Yeah.
And often it's like very personal. Like a lot of people, for instance, like depression and stuff. A lot of that is like self-defeating thoughts. So you have these like very intense beliefs that you're definitely going to fail, or you're definitely going to like, you know.
Yeah. Like
Um,
somehow 7 out of the 8 people thinks this person will fail and this person is extremely intelligent. Sorry, 7 out of 8 people think this person will succeed, but this person is extremely intelligent, and they continue to think that absolutely they're gonna fail at everything they do. I mean, I don't know. Most people don't think of depression as overconfidence, but in like the statistical sense, this is something
yeah.
like that. And then there's other, you could flip the science and still get similar results.
I mean, like cognitive behavioral therapy, I think a lot of that is basically trying to get calibrated, basically, in some ways. It's
Yeah,
in
it's
one
basically
direction, right? Yeah.
yeah, it's basically getting you to do the internal modeling of what other people would say about you to like to get like a way use your models of other people to get outside view on yourself. That's a lot of cognitive behavior therapy from what I understand.
So I read some of the Feeling Good author. No, that's not it at all. Oh yeah, David Burns. I like that I could look up people. I don't have to like remember them as if it were more of a recorded thing.
Yeah,
But I read some of that, and the podcast is also pretty interesting. But at least in that, like he goes over a lot of people's basically, overconfidence and how bad things are going to be in a whole bunch of ways. And a lot of you could actually resolve it yourself. You don't always have to think about what someone else would say. Um, but yeah, also like just knowing other smart people, a lot of them could be like very correct in some parts of their life, but then like very incorrect on some personal things or in some leadership things, right? They'll say like
Yeah,
this
for sure.
plan is just totally crazy. Like Steve Jobs and all the famous people were just kind of crazy like 5% of the time or something.
Yeah, I think it's relevant to separate out like beliefs that you might have as a researcher or like as somebody who's trying to push a particular thing, like in an entrepreneur or researcher or whatever, and beliefs that are correct or like beliefs that are, sorry, correct is a bit of loaded term, but like I personally like, you know, have the lowest Brier score, log law score, or some sense of like most accurate in a technical sense. Because I think a lot of times like having like somewhat false beliefs like is what gets you very good results in a lot of cases. Like I think it's just in practice, I think it's very hard for people to like sacrifice their life for the outside view, for example.
Oh yeah.
Like if you don't have strong inside view models of exactly how things are gonna go and you don't believe it deeply, I think it's really hard to make like really successful things on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then like, given that, like maybe like if the question you really want to know is, what's the probability of short timelines in AI? Maybe like the people who have very strong beliefs, internal beliefs in this, like Demis Hassabis from DeepMind, or an AI safety researcher or whatever, they may not like necessarily be the best people in that regard.
Yeah, this has a lot of interesting topics. So the question of like when false beliefs are useful, I think is like a whole topic in itself.
Yeah.
My impression is that from looking at society, I think beliefs are like the true beliefs about important things. When important means like the things that people debate or things. That's
Yeah.
like priority number like 30 for most organizations and people. That's just like really low on the list. It should, like, people pretend like it's important that they're accurate about these things, but if you actually look at their decisions, it's hard to infer that from that.
Yeah.
For instance, like not many people are seeking out information about are they bad parents, or not many people like Republican or like Democrats are like actively seeking out information to convince them of the other side.
Yeah.
I think, but that creates problems because it creates correlated errors, right? Like my sense is that like right now we basically have these like huge correlated errors, and the super forecasters that we have can't really get out of that much from what I've seen, or it's not obvious that they can. And like tricks to get out of that would be the valuable stuff. Of course, it would also come with a lot of downsides because there are a lot of reasons why people have these errors, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
It's also like reality doesn't slam me as much as I thought. Like it would, like from some years ago. It was just like, rationality is winning or whatever, but it just turns out like you could just do pretty damn well without being rational. And there's a few domains where this
yeah,
is not true. Like poker, you get slammed really hard, for example, being just like slightly irrational, like over a long enough time span. Just the inaccuracies just pile on. But yeah, in most things in life, it just people muddle through and doesn't. You could be like successful at business or like research or whatever, and still be wrong about a ton of things.
my impression is that like one of the most amazing things about a lot of entrepreneurs is that they are very good about being right about some very specific things, and they're also very good about being incredibly wrong about other things, and they just like keep those very different. So like almost all entrepreneurs are overconfident. There's quite a bit of evidence about that. And
Yeah.
separately, some of what makes them good is just by pointing out other people's flaws and being right about like a lot of details, right? Like a lot of entrepreneurs would do poorly if they were just always way overconfident about the budget month to month, right? Like that would suck. Or if they just made the wrong technical decisions all the time, that would also suck. So my impression is that often they're uncorrelated and somewhat calibrated on a lot of the technical decisions. And those, it's important that they're correct. But a lot of the big things, it's very important that they're incorrect, right? It's very important that they're going to be like highly overconfident or something.
I'm not sure that correct on technical decisions. I feel like there's just a lot of like, I don't know, you get the noise is high enough that you can like make tons of like, system design errors and still basically muddle through and like, I don't know, use this, I don't know,
Yeah,
really
I mean,
bad like relational database or whatever, and like, it can't scale you in a factor of 3, but it's fine because you get, it's fine because you get 10x money if you just barely manage to pull through and then fix it later.
but you do have to be pretty accurate about some of these aspects. Like you have to do some things well. In some cases, it's making a good tech stack. And often in a lot of tech companies, I think they do have pretty good tech setups in total. Right? In other companies, maybe they're able to do it well in other ways. Like I think Facebook, like Mark Zuckerberg seemed to be very good in the beginning at making Facebook as like an engineer. and as someone leading it. Google,
Yeah.
they seem to be making pretty reasonable decisions.
Facebook was based on. Sorry, this is
Apple too.
very.
Yeah, it's
This is
PHP.
very specific, but yeah. Yeah. Okay. So backtracking, like why?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like. Yeah, I think like I think super forecasters are. And like most people who do short-term forecasting, right, or short-term medium-term forecasting, are like pretty good at getting feedback from reality and updating based on that. Like in cases where like getting feedback from reality is like easy and you have like obvious signals and a few other details. I suspect you could generalize this to like they're probably better than average at getting feedback from a lot of other things. Like to the extent that there's like a right politics, it is the case that super forecasters on average are like, they do have more similar politics than I don't know, the American population as a whole, for example. And they have like
Definitely.
more like more specific details about their politics will probably converge more similarly to say, I don't know, academia probably. I'm not sure about this, but it vaguely seems that way from several I talked to. I mean, there are like exceptions, like some of them have very extreme views or whatever, but
Yeah, I think there's like no group of people I could point to and say that they're probably more epistemically good than super forecasters reliably. Like that come to mind. Like every other group, like maybe some
finance,
rationalists.
I don't
Finance
know,
is complicated. Finance is
yeah,
complicated. Yeah.
yeah, quant trading maybe, but yeah,
Yeah. No, I'd
like
agree.
definitely not our finance, but they're probably like subgroups.
Yeah, I'd agree
Uh,
with that. Like those are
yeah,
some of the best. Although I don't think that they like one of my problems with them is that often, from what I understand, they're often like pretty narrow. So they'd be focused on being
yeah.
correct about some very specific things in finance, but
I
not.
agree. I mean, even one extreme example is poker, right? Like in poker, like people are really damn correct about poker play,
Yeah,
like
no,
at the top. Yeah, like nobody's gonna be epistemically better than them, except maybe like AI is getting better. So maybe it's coming close to the point where like artificial intelligence is better. But yeah, I'm like humans.
yeah.
In that
But,
particular narrative, no.
so in this case, so I think with COVID also that was a case where I believe the super forecasters didn't do that great a job at like
Yeah,
realizing it was a thing, especially initially, right? And that's what we
yeah,
really would like to get
yeah.
to.
I think they did better. I think they did better than some infectious disease experts, but probably not the median, and definitely not like the best ones. Um, and they did worse than Metaculus, and I think they did worse than a reasonable fraction of like other amateur forecasters. I suspect that there's two different biases that goes like there's two different reasons that goes on that I think are systematic biases. I think like this was predictably off. One of which is super relevant to long-term stuff, and one of which is not. The one that is not is I think they didn't update as fast as should have been like knowable in principle and in practice from the evidence. So for example, like I don't know, like when I was doing like COVID forecasting, like I was like basically making updates on like close for some questions at least. I was making updates like every couple of days, showing occasionally like 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 a few questions like twice a day or so, just because like there was just like so much data, like the margins are very thin for those questions. Sorry, the important parts of the questions like actually just have very wobbly based on the evidence that comes in. So it'd be like a week out how many like cases there will be, and there's just like testing was so bad or whatever. I think the super classes are probably much slower. Like most of the questions that are interesting are geopolitical questions where like, mostly you make an update every couple of weeks, and occasionally like news really comes in, and then you got to update them. But it's not common where you have a bunch of different questions where like every couple of days, like you might like change by a couple of percentage points or a couple of thousand in the absolute numbers or whatever. So that's one thing. I think this is mostly relevant to like the long-term AI stuff we're interested in for like fairly obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Except in the case of once an emergency happens, that might be really that good to know soon. Yeah. The other thing is I think like this is basically an out of distribution problem. I think like once you're well trained within distribution and you're super calibrated within distribution, then you get like bad, like you aren't as good as like as seeing like all the distribution problems or like seeking information that like this confirms your like hypothesis and stuff like that. I think to some degree this was also true for like the original top predictors of Metaculus, like people who joined, like people who like noticed that like Metaculus wasn't predicting that well, like me and like maybe 20, 30, maybe more others,
Yeah.
Just like had like more naive, like, oh man, I don't know what's going on, I'm gonna actually look at the evidence prior. Whereas like people who have been predicting Metaculus a couple years, like got used to, making an update every like week or two, got used to like the specific data sources that they were looking at for a lot of questions, stuff like that. I think something similar is a bit true with my extremely like, amateur and like, outside the like not super clear like understanding of like infectious disease community. I think like a reasonable number of public statements that have been made, and like semi-private statements that I was able to see, like, like town halls with like medical doctors, for example, where like the infectious disease people give a presentation to like what the doctors think, blah, blah, blah. It seems like they were like operating on like mostly business as normal prior, especially in February and to some degree like early March. Not often, definitely, like, Leipzig was not, for example, by then, like, Johns Hopkins was not, and so forth. But like there's definitely a decent percentage of people who assumed, like, based on prior experiences, that this would be closer to like the 2009 H1N1 or so forth, without like looking at enough at like the actual data on the ground to update away from that prior.
I think one huge question here, both for this and also like for our stuff, but this being COVID, is basically not like what should individual forecasters have done, but like what would be some configuration that we could have come up with that would have done much better. Right? Like maybe like combining the super forecasters with like some intense meticulous people and like quickly putting a whole lot of money on it or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of
Yeah.
like one thing I'll be really excited about is you have like something like a forecasting emergency response team, where you have like there's different configurations that's possible. One is like something like kind of like a National Guard or National Reserve, like a reserve forecasting team, where like, they're paid like, some amount of money to like once a month. They, they some combination of, they make predictions every couple of days, and like once a month they gather together, do a training session. And then like when shit hits the fan, might want to edit that out. Actually,
It's fine. I think
yeah. Like when things get really bad, like, like COVID bad, where, probability of like nuclear war like currently exceeds 10% for this year or some other crazy things. Then you just get off them, like, to be like, okay, stop doing your day jobs. Like, this is the, we're calling you in. And then just start doing like full-time, like rapid response forecasting. I think this will get you like pretty reasonable results. I think like, having like feedback from the experts, like academic experts, will like increase the results. But I think just getting that feedback would be pretty, even without that, like might still be better than like the current epistemic processes we have. Another thing we could do is like expert aggregations, where like right now, like, I don't know, it's like, individuals write papers, and, individuals get public statements, and like, a month later there's a meta-analysis of the papers, which is like really bad for emergencies, especially. Less important in non-emergencies, but because like the timing lag is less important in those cases. But still, like, it seems like if you have long-running like platforms like Johns Hopkins, back when I mean the PIs, so they had like a disease prediction project, which, was technically open to the public, but I think most people there were like medical people. Medical people were public health people. Yeah, so that was like kind of an early warning sign, and that could definitely have been improved. I think CSET is like doing their like, AI forecasting thing. I haven't like looked at the specific questions. I don't know how useful they really are, but I'm sure there's like other projects like that.
I think, like, obviously I'm in a lot of agreement here. One of the big challenges is just like in the EA community, at least, who's going to be doing this? I feel like a lot of this, or at least around EA, if we have someone who's pretty strong, who wants to write a lot of forecasting questions and work with organizations to make sure that they're useful, having a good fit there seems quite useful to me. I know Metaculus has had trouble finding people, also making sure that the whole pipeline is working. In a bigger sense is a big question of like, but I think, forecasting teams, awesome. One question here too is like, I think in a COVID case, if we were being very smart about it, it's not just like once we set the alarm bell, then we work. It's also a question of like, how do we know which alarm bells to hit and when, which is like a huge challenge of itself, right? like hypothetically, we could have imagined, like we could have calculated that at some point that it was like very high expected value to look into, even though the chances seemed super low. That's what I'd
Yeah.
really want to get to. And then like when that happens, we immediately like trigger, even though we're still a few, like, at this point, the whole thing is very low probability.
Yeah. Like what percentage of probability does like things hit such that like it's worth triggering?
Yeah.
And it's possible, you get like a trigger and then 3 days later, like all the forecasts is like, nope. And then they go back.
Yeah. I mean, I'd imagine like basically what we're talking about, maybe one way of describing it is like trying to forecast black swans, right?
Yeah. I
Where
like this impression. Yeah.
there's so many possible black swans out there, right? So like obviously you'll eventually find out about them, and obviously you can't guess them too much in advance, but you can have some better idea. And if you're being very smart, you'll like realize that some of them are a bit likely and the EV is very high to like do a lot more investigation, even though in most cases it's going to come out to be a dud, right?
Yeah, for some of these things, like for like for pandemic specifically, and probably a few other things you guys are interested in, like it's not like I'm vaguely optimistic that at some point, some of our like friends in government, like the American government, for example, might be sufficiently excited about it.
Yeah.
Like I don't know, like in theory, like this could be under IALPA or some other like intelligence agency type thing.
I'd say quickly, my impression is that IARPA would be not the best place because IARPA is made for like specific one-time scientific projects, not like long-lasting. But yeah, between different governments and not philanthropic donors, I could imagine a lot of options. There's so many governments to choose from.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's like a sense in which like emergency pandemic response forecasting just seems like something that like, I mean, especially after doing it after this particular pandemic, maybe like we could just like really push that really hard. Like I imagine like what's going to happen is you have some journalists forecasters, you have some like people with lots of infectious disease experience, you have like some data people or whatever, like coming together as a group, and then you can get results. I mean, like right now, the current setups are mostly focused on people with like very strong academic credentials, and like which is a somewhat different skill set than the thing we're exactly interested in. Although, like I think that I don't know, I feel like people in the know within the EA community have like basically identified the right experts or something for biosecurity. Like Mark Lipsitch was sounding an alarm like really early, for example.
Yeah,
and I think like there are just a small list of people like that for each field that we might be concerned about. Like once they sound the alarm, then the super forecasters or other forecasting groups could like do the work and like identify whether this like this person says 10% chance, do we actually think it's like a 3% chance or a 70% chance, and work the way. But I don't know, I feel like at least for the US, I think probably Europe too, like if by the time Lipsitch was sounding an alarm, people just started like forecasting quickly and then like reading all the evidence they could and then like suggesting things to government, and then the government responding within like a reasonable time scale, like things will have been a lot safer. I mean, there's a bunch of different steps here, like the government responding time skip thing is like might be just really hard to do after you get the accurate answers. But yeah, at this point we haven't even gotten to a point where we have an epistemic process that like gives us very clear and public knowledge of like either expert opinion or some sense of these are epistemically on average better people or processes that coming up with things, and this is the answer. Like the stock market was really slow, for example.
I'm not sure if so there's a debate about the stock market, right?
Sure.
Like it's just like hard to understand. I think basically for everyone, but
yeah, VIX, I don't know, VIX didn't go up until like late February, I think. Like the volatility index, that's my evidence. Yeah, maybe it's not very good. I mean, there's a lot of details that's going on, like expected return isn't the most important thing compared to like liquidity, blah blah blah, lots of details. Yeah.
I'm in general like hesitant to make speculations on like things the stock market should have done differently. Just because it is.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair because it's such a strong predictor and it's so hard. Okay, let me rephrase that. It was not possible. It was very difficult for us to get common knowledge based on the stock market movements of what should have, like of what predictions are there out there.
But definitely, yeah.
For COVID at least. Yeah.
I think that's pretty obvious. And for a lot of the
Yeah.
other interesting black swans, I imagine we'll want to know about them way before the stock market would give any signal. Like the stock market is just like a super crude signal. It's like really hard to interpret, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, even like, now the S&P is doing well, but a lot of that's because like government regulation. Does that mean that the economy is doing well? I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, it's very confusing.
Back quickly, one point. I mean, this maybe good to have a separate thing on, but there's a question of like what would a good forecasting team look like that you kind of referenced, but I just want to flag this because the things done in the super forecasting experiments or the good judgment experiments were very much like you just have people who are trained or who are proven to be amazing at forecasting. You just put these
Yeah.
people together and like have them go. And that's also kind of the model of Metaculus and these other sites.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
think,
they might have heterogeneous experiences, but they're like pretty homogeneous in like their role on the team.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think my general impression is that actually cost-effective and useful forecasting teams in the future are going to look a lot more like small hedge funds or other small groups of intelligence divisions, basically, or like reporting divisions, where you basically have like a big set of skills of different types that work well with each other. You have a whole bunch of people doing nothing but like just trying to do fact finding or something, or just like reporting. Yeah, I think of it a lot like a small intelligence division, basically. And like, unfortunately, intelligence is, of course, the word connects to the military, which is such a sad thing because intelligence, like the same structures, could apply for a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Data analysts are also called business intelligence people sometimes. Stuff like. Yeah, but definitely, yeah. When you refer to intelligence in like this domain, definitely connects to the military more.
So when you look at what a forecasting team does, some of what they do, or at least what the super forecasters have done, when they worked with us and others, I loved was basically they just go and get the real data, right?
Yeah.
So if they're curious, from what I've heard, also if they're curious about a specific country, they'll like read the newspapers in that country and like use Google Translate and like call up friends in that country and like write the responses down and like share that with people. Like it's
Yeah.
just like way more intense than I think a lot of other people would be, and that's like one of the main ways that they get an advantage. But I'd imagine that if we were to do a great job going forward, if we were to scale that, it would look like we basically have like this group basically has a big network globally of all these like contacts and experts that they could like reach out to, right? And maybe some people are doing nothing but full time, like they're just like calling people, writing down the information, trying to do this like like really hacky journalism or whatever.
Yeah, one thing that was surprising to me is that like from like good judge from project stuff is they don't really have executive assistants or super forecasters.
Yeah, no, it's a huge question.
Yeah.
My impression is that that would just mess up experiments. It would make experiments kind of weird. Like oh, now we have two people who are like, yeah, and then like also they just don't have like they don't pair them with a lot of other possible skills like managers or data scientists, typically like people who are just going to do data science or like a whole bunch of Upwork type stuff. I imagine could be nice.
Yeah. I mean, one thing to flag is data science could be quite expensive, and
of course, yeah.
Yeah, relative to like rates that super forecasters usually get paid or whatever. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that also tells you something else. But if you look at like what a small hedge fund does, or I think Smarkets, like they have a team basically trying to estimate sports questions, right? And on their team, I think it's like 1/3, 1/2 engineers. A lot of that is like data infrastructure. And then the other people are kind of a collection between like judgmental folk who try to just understand it, or like some data scientists. And I'm sure they have like a lot of operations and like help with that.
Yeah.
My impression is that that kind of thing is a better model of what to expect. Will be like cost effective for us for things like this.
It really depends on how good the data is, right? Because sports has amazing data. Like, I don't know, sabermetric. Like the reason why sabermetrics really took off, like before other sports or like other things, isn't like baseball fans are smarter or whatever. It's just baseball just had much better data for the relevant things, and then like other sports also just have better data than a lot like politics say, and politics have like political polls have better data than like I don't know early stage pandemic response and so forth.
So yeah, I mean, there's also another interesting question. Like I would definitely agree. On the other hand, though, there's a question of like where we expect these like setups to be useful going forward. I think that there's a huge amount of evidence that different organizations have been able to cost effectively put together setups that can, put together data and like display it in different ways, right? Like this is like obviously lots of groups do this, seems great for them. It's not obvious at all that anyone justifies the cost of like forecasting in this way, right? Oh, that's like tiny right now. Like forecasting in like this specific good judgment project, like the market for that is like really, really small compared to the market for data. So I think like I wouldn't be that surprised, and there are different reasons for that, but I wouldn't be that surprised if in the future, if you wanted to like estimate black swans, for instance, a lot of that may be about like just collecting data about all the possible things and then making that apparent to everyone, right? And that'd be like a big part of the equation. Some of it would be directly used for the forecasters, but some of it would also be used by the people just interested in this information. For one thing, people trust data a lot more than they do forecasters right now. Like people trust data probably more than they should. And I think people don't trust basically anyone to do what forecasters are doing generally, like in areas where they disagree. So
yeah.
There's also the thing that like over time, the trend in the stock market, I think, is for things to get automated more and more.
Yeah, I mean, there's just more and more data, or like it's easier and easier to collect data for various
and algorithms
reasons.
are also getting better, right?
True.
Or like they could use data that they typically weren't able to reuse for things. So I think in terms of like a long-term trajectory, we shouldn't be expecting to like have only humans all the time everywhere. Like that's just kind of a failure mode. Like we just kind of bound ourselves to lose out compared to other solutions.
Sure. The robots increasingly take over more and more things.
Yeah, like, so we should kind of assume that like in order to answer questions like this, we want to aim for things that'll get more automated in a way that'll be good for us.
Yeah.
Lots of.
I guess the flip side is maybe you might expect like the things that you care about to be like, you might expect other people to be able to do the data stuff or something.
Yeah, that's a huge question. So then there's a question of like, how good was all the data work around this stuff before? And I mean, basically,
that's
like
not exactly it, because like there's the general much better data, like there's like that trajectory that we're talking about, right? So the question is more like in 5 years, like without us, like or without EAs trying to do this, like we just get much better data for the things that need to get good data on.
So I'm not saying that we need to develop new techniques for coming up with data. I'm just saying that like if we were to spend $1 million to $5 million a year, to say, on a forecasting operation, that it would probably provide the most value if some of the people on it were just collecting data and organizing that data.
I tentatively agree. I think
like every year, the value that would be coming out would be maximized if some of it, what it does is create data. And I think
sounds right.
Yeah, it's not too hard to justify, I think. But there's a big question of like how much and like how is all of this stuff going to play?
Yeah. Both coming up with data and like database modeling. I think like, I mean, most forecasters I know, super forecasters, people on attack, to a lesser degree, people on attack list, good judgment open, whatever, are, fairly mathy people, but like they haven't, they don't have experience like working in machine learning team, or like, mostly, some of them do obviously, or like, being in like seeing like the places where like data analysis and stuff like that is really good. So beyond just data collection, like database modeling and human hybrid stuff will be pretty good. That said, I know Good Judgment has like done some experiments, and in those particular narrow domain things, like pure human teams have like managed to like be better on most metrics than like human plus.
Okay, so I'm going to give my rant here.
Sure, go for it.
So my rant is this. Basically, like academic papers and stuff are very good for signaling that there's correctness, right? Like you could point to an academic paper and be like, oh, they did a study, therefore we know that it's like good. But the vast majority of information that we have in the world about like how a group could efficiently come up with information or just like come up with estimations or prediction is outside of academic papers. Like almost none of these other groups are doing this. So I think that like the Good Judgment specific study is pretty small compared to all the other research we should be using about how to combine humans and AI. And in the scheme of things, I think like the vast majority of that is saying, yes, we want to combine them in different ways. Like that seems to be the way of the future. Like if you look at basically what any group with money is spending money on, there's a different question, which is like, how valuable are these studies at all? I think it is kind of valid to say that a lot of them probably are much less valuable than we'd like to think. Just because, like, you kind of take people in some very specific settings with some specific tools like that need to be optimized for a specific set. And it's very hard to take results of that and then apply them in like other very different settings, right? So for instance, like, here's one question, which is like, why is Google, like, if it were the case that we could run a lot of scientific experiments on how well people act in different situations for them to do well in teams and stuff, and if that were very useful for improving the way that these run, then why isn't Google and Apple and like the other really big companies, like, do they have their own experimental divisions? Is that like a huge part of their decision making for how organizations and like groups of people should work? Right.
Sorry, can you operationalize this slightly better?
Yeah, sure. So
sorry, better might not be good, but yeah, can you try again, I guess?
no, it's definitely, sorry, it's like a bit tricky. So like, for instance, there is some literature on like how to run a good meeting. So one way to figure out how to run a good meeting is that you could basically try to figure out very specific experiments where you say, oh, let's try to have participants A be the control and participants B be the non-control. And then we'll like see how well they do. And then we'll take the result of that, and then that'll be a way to teach other people. Like, that's a way that you could learn about how to run meetings. Another way that you could learn to run meetings is basically by having a lot of meetings, like having a culture, like a big company or something with a bunch of smart people, and they try things and kind of intuitively feel what works.
Yeah.
Right. My guess is like, if the first one were like super useful, then the big companies would be doing a lot of it. Like, if it were the case that like it was cost effective for us to do experiments on like how to have meetings, and like we could optimize that, like, if that's the majority of how we'd learn about this stuff, then a lot of companies would be doing it. And my impression is that for multiple reasons, one being that humans are just very complicated and it's very hard to take the studies, results of one study and put them in another situation, is worse than ML. It's just like typically is just not cost effective. So I from what I gather, the vast majority of the intuitions about in Google and these companies about how to have meetings, like, there is literature about it, but it's like an afterthought for them. Like, it looks nice, it sounds good when they reference it, like, oh, we had the scientists come in and help us run meetings. But the vast majority of their knowledge about how to run good meetings comes outside of scientific studies.
Some of them comes from semi-scientific studies. It would be like survey results, for example, rather than randomized control trials. Like observational.
And I think like observational stuff is, in a sense, that's basically like, how do we have very cheap experiments? We don't have to do the experiments, but we just like get the data. And that would be super interesting in the space of forecasting. Because there's like so much going on. We have to define forecasting carefully, but
sure.
But I'd imagine that would just be far more interesting than just looking at the very specific experiments that have been done.
I see. Yeah.
And if we can't actually do the observational studies, what we could do is just like talk to the people, look at the people, like try to, get a sense of what people are doing as like a first step. In the future, it would be interesting to like have big surveys or things like that.
I think this is like this is saying the qualitative, this is kind of saying like a lot of the information we get is qualitative analysis, kind of, like, ironically enough.
Well, I'd say like specifically, at this point it is. At this point, I think a lot of the questions about, basically, there are like, 1,000 parameters that we have to decide on for what future forecasting setup is going to be, right? If we try to solve the majority of this by running experiments, we're going to have to run a whole lot of experiments.
You just don't get enough power. So you have you end up having to use a lot of your intuition or whatever.
And the experiments take, 2 to 5 years. So, if the technology is in 2 to 5 years different, and the teams are different, and maybe the group of people they're working with are just different than the groups that are willing to sign up and get paid for on the salaries of the experiments, right? So, that's So that's one thing. Going back, the specific study that they did on hybrid intelligence, I don't know much about it. My impression is that you're right, but my impression is that it's also a very narrow study, like a lot of these things. It's like one very specific way of looking at humans versus machines. And I think for that, it wasn't that great, but it's so trivial to come up with other ones that machines would easily dominate for instance, like the one I go to is like, if you want people to, if you want to predict how many people have COVID in every single like state in the world or every like subpopulation, like per week for the next like 50 weeks, like you just can't have humans doing that. If humans try, they just do poorly without using at least some amount of automation.
I mean, depends on how many humans you have.
You need a whole lot of super forecasters, like more than
You need
exist.
like, yeah, you need one for every like couple million people or something.
Yeah, and they'd have to be like full time, like indefinitely.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's in principle affordable, but yeah, definitely not at the state we're currently doing.
Like if you, I mean, if I feel like if you had that many super forecasters, I'd way prefer them to use some automation to like predict something more than, right? Because then at that point it's like, oh, just predict it for every single person, right? And then like with a bit of
couple
automation.
million is very different from couple every single person, but yes.
Well, you can have a model that predicts it for each person, like an estimator.
Yeah, sure.
And I can imagine possibly getting kind of narrow, right?
Yeah,
I'm not saying it. Yeah, you don't have to do an amazing job. You just have to do better than like a lot of the alternatives.
Base intuitions, for example, or like the current like very simple statistical stuff that people sometimes throw around.
Yeah, and in this case, like hopefully better than what other models would suggest. But a lot of models don't even try to do it for the person, right?
Yeah. So I agree.
So we've been going for 55 minutes. I should go to bed soon. Yes. Anything else that you'd like to talk about to wrap up?
Yeah.
It's quite a bit of material there.
Yeah. I think we started talking about long-term, like, how to do long-term forecasting, and then we diverged into forecasting teams, a bunch of tangents. I wonder if there's on the subject of qualitative feedback with experiments or whatever, I wonder if there's like a fast way for us to gather data or like, pseudo data on whether people prefer this type of discussion to like more structured ones.
So, yeah, I think that this is a great question. I guess I'm just trying to think like some of this conversation is stuff that we probably want to have not recorded or may just be uninterested to people who are watching this. So I guess like, yeah, one question for those watching is like, what in general of all the possible things should we change in the future? Right? Like, I imagine there are a whole bunch of options over there.
Yeah.
Maybe we should both be replaced with like two super forecasters. They should be the ones doing this. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that already exists, right? Like, well, not on this specific topic, but like Scott Eastman has his like podcast and stuff. So they have like podcasts talk.
Non-Profits, the podcast, I recommend it, especially the interviews that they have with other people. I think those are like the main ones. Anything else?
No, yeah. We'll see how this goes.
Yeah, if you're watching, I hope you enjoy this, and let us know in the comments if you have any suggestions of ways to improve it, or if you found it valuable. That would also be good for us to know. Right. Cool.
Yeah, if you find it super not valuable, let us know too.
Of course. Yeah. Cool.